Okay. I think it asks you to okay that. Um, let's go ahead and get started with your name, title, and if you could spell your name, that would be great.
Sure. My name is David Jesuit. That's Jesuit. I'm a professor of political science and chairperson of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at Central Michigan University.
Okay. Thank you for being here, and let's just go ahead and get started. I mean, every day there's something big happening with the Russians evacuating the embassy in Ukraine today, one of the newest things, and the sanctions that continue to come. Um, what are your thoughts? Are we headed to a full invasion here?
So I think, yes, we are headed to a full invasion of Ukraine. President Biden has suggested that, has indicated that that's where we're headed. Certainly, the military forces that have assembled around the country support that idea that the intention is to occupy uh, all of Ukraine in a invasion. Um, so I suspect that that will occur. I don't think that I'm not 100% confident. I suppose I'm still hopeful, as President Zelensky is president of Ukraine, that they can avoid that kind of invasion. But certainly, the invasion, had started really, 8 years ago, um, in the eastern part of the country with forces, insurgents, separatists in those predominantly Russian speaking regions rising up, um, certainly with support from Russia. And then Putin's very recent official recognition of those provinces as sovereign, independent countries. I think he's the only one who has recognized them in that way. So the invasion really began, um, 8 years ago, but that was a small part of the country. This looks like it's going to be the entire country. I hope I'm wrong.
Obviously, Ukraine is not a NATO member, and the president has said that we are not sending our troops in Ukraine to fight Russians. What what will be the response other than sanctions? I mean, that's like a slap on the hand for taking over an entire country.
Well, I think that the issue has to do with uh, limiting the consequences to Ukraine. And so that's what the United States and NATO has been focused on, is reassuring those allies um, that were part of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, and I'm thinking of Poland in particular, but Hungary as well, and the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Uh, you know, they want to send a clear message to leaders and the people of those countries that their commitments that they've made under NATO will be respected under Article 5, and they want to send the message clearly to Putin that you might get away with invading Ukraine, uh, but do not test our resolve and invade a NATO country. And um, I my fear would be that there's some miscalculation on Putin's part and that he does invade a NATO country. I don't think that's likely. I think the message is pretty clear. Um, but, you know, uh, things have happened, miscalculations have been made, and I think that the U.S. has been working to send the clearest message possible to that. Don't do that, because that is unacceptable. So I suspect that Ukraine will be defeated. The Ukrainian military, they'll be occupied. There will be an insurgency, and they'll try to punish, keep Russia, limit the advantages that Russia receives from occupying that country. The United States knows what it's like to occupy a country. and fight an insurgency, and so does Russia. And that's probably not going to be sustainable over the long period, but over perhaps up to the next decade, that might characterize the situation of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. Those are that's the hardest part, is because that suffering of the Ukrainian people, I mean, that's already begun. That's the real tragedy. And no, I don't think there's anything that will be done. To Sanctions won't work. I mean, uh, American people won't support, I don't think, neither will the Europeans, a military response to try to push Russia back out of Ukraine. That's just not in the cards. I would argue it's not ultimately in U.S. national security interest to try to get involved in a land war over Ukraine. Um, what is clearly in U.S. national security interest is try to limit any of this to Ukraine and not allow it to spill over into a NATO country, or not allow it to spill over into Asia, because clearly, People's Republic of China and President Xi are looking very carefully and very interested in how the U.S. will respond, and that makes it, I suppose, even more imperative that the United States uphold its commitments to NATO countries, because if the U.S. doesn't do that, then that sends the message that those guarantees to Taiwan, for example, or Republic of Korea aren't very meaningful, and the United States can't put itself in that position. So it's pretty clear that there's a line that cannot be crossed without substantial consequences, uh, potentially catastrophic consequences.
Okay. There's still the possibility, though, that he could go to other regions. Couldn't he move on to Georgia or
Sure.
some of the other? Just keep expanding.
Yeah, he's already done that. I mean, this has been contested territory for hundreds of years. And I mean, I'm speaking specifically of Ukraine. And so Ukraine itself is divided, and even the history of Ukraine is divided by those who give it a little bit of a Russian spin, versus those who I think characterize the history more oriented toward Europe. Uh, and so over the last several hundred years, this Ukrainian identity has struggled to assert itself over Russian dominance. And we've seen that in the Second World War. Of course, under the Soviet Union, it was fairly easy to suppress Ukrainian identity with a totalitarian regime that was part of the Soviet Union. I mean, Russia was the official language, and um, and people only spoke Ukrainian at home. But with independence and the fall of the Soviet Union, that kind of Ukrainian identity has been allowed to be expressed, and we've seen that, and so there's an aspiration, I think, of Ukrainians to get the same security guarantees that, for example, their neighbors in Poland received when Poland joined NATO in 1999. I think that's a very legitimate aspiration, and the Polish people, I think, have benefited tremendously from the security guarantees of NATO and expansion into the European Union. So that zone of peace and prosperity is has grown, and I think many in Ukraine, I would say a majority, hope that that zone of peace and prosperity can extend to include them. Putin doesn't want that.
So I know it was a different time, different leadership, but when Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia joined NATO, there didn't seem to be this uh, pushback. Is it just because of the timing of it?
I mean, this is a great question, and I've gone back and I've done some a little bit of research and digging into this. And so, when the Berlin Wall fell in '89 and Germany unified, really Berlin Wall falls in November 1989. Germany is unified less than a year later in October 1990. And Western leaders at the time debated. This is George Herbert Walker Bush, Margaret Thatcher, Francois Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl of West Germany. They debated NATO enlargement to include a unified Germany. And they eventually persuaded Gorbachev that this was consistent with NATO's mission, which had been described as, the purpose of NATO is to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. And so that was very real concern of those leaders like Thatcher and Mitterrand, who remembered the Second World War. So they persuaded Gorbachev, okay, we can have unified Federal Republic of Germany. They're in NATO. But oh no, we're not going to go any further than that. And there's, I think, overwhelming evidence showing that those commitments were made. Nothing was signed, no treaty. And Putin mentions this all the time. I think he's right. Those assurances were made, but once those countries became sovereign, independent countries, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic started it, their leaders and the people, they wanted the same security guarantees. They wanted to join NATO. And I think there were some already in the US and Western Europe that maybe weren't so sincere and thought there was enough wiggle room. And yeah, then NATO began to expand, and the European Union began to expand, and it eventually included those other former Soviet republics, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And it was remarkable that had occurred. But it was really right after that Putin began to meddle in Ukrainian domestic affairs. With the domestic elections, we saw a poisoning of a presidential candidate in 2004. So it was right around that time, though, that Russia began signaling this, like, wow, we let this happen? And I don't know how we let this happen. You said it wasn't going to happen, but it's not going any further, and it won't include Ukraine. But Ukraine is a sovereign, independent country. If they want to join NATO, then the U.S. position and the position of the other NATO countries is they should decide. So Putin has drawn that line. And he said that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So he's made it very clear that he's had ambitions to restore Russian, empire. Part of that, if you're going to restore Russian empire, Ukraine is right on the border, and there are a lot of natural resources there, and they've been trying to assert their control over Ukraine again, hundreds of years, and so it's just clear that that's part of his grand plan of his vision of restoring Russia. You're not going to do it if you don't have Ukraine. So that's where he's headed, and I, I don't think he'll succeed, but he's definitely pursuing a strategy that he's articulated,
He's going to
over a
try.
decade ago. Yeah, he's going to try. Yeah. Yes.
So I think I have what I need. Is there anything else that you think is important for people to know in the situation?
Well, I think that, while there might be some disruptions that will occur, higher energy prices, disruptions probably as a result of cyber attacks on civilian infrastructure and finances, those inconveniences and disruptions will pale in comparison to, I think, the human tragedy that's unfolding and will unfold in Ukraine. And so I hope that we can just bear that in mind, that as maybe our lives are inconvenienced, and I don't want to minimize that either, but it will be quite tragic for tens of thousands of Ukrainians as their country is invaded. I think we just need to bear that in mind.
Okay. Well, thank you, sir. We'll have
Alrighty.
we'll have a bit of this on our 5 o'clock news, but I'm going to ask our digital team to put the rest on our YouTube channel.
Great. No problem.
Okay.
Thanks for inviting me. Have a good day.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Sure. Bye.